this Starbucks was here in the frame the whole time. Oops. Hello everyone, my name is Yara and today I'm going to be doing a recent reads video. So these are going to be books that I've read, I think since August. I know, I'm kind of late, it's been a while. And also most of these books are middle grade because I was doing the middle grade magic readathon in August, and then I've also been doing the Rick Riordan Presents read along. So there's just a lot of middle grade going on, but also one YA, so some diversity to the mix. I think we have about 11 books to talk about today, but 2 of these are in series, so I'm going to talk about those as a group as opposed to individual books, so hopefully it won't last too long. So without further ado, let's just get into it. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Mystwick School for Musicraft by Jessica Corey. This takes place in a world where music is a source of magic, and our main character, Amelia Jones, has a dream of attending the Mystwick School for Musicraft, which is one of the best schools in the world for music. However, during her audition, a lot of things go awry, and just when she thinks that her dream has ended, she receives a letter that she can attend the Mystwick School. However, she's only there on probation, and so she has to spend the next 2 months proving that she deserves to be there. While she's there, she also starts to uncover a little bit of a mystery that's going on in the school. So I really enjoyed this novel. I thought it was delightful. It's one of those things where the concept can sound a little bit basic, and it also employs a lot of common tropes, but it just executes them really well. That makes the reading experience really enjoyable. I really enjoyed the world and the world building aspects. The author spent a lot of time trying to really incorporate how music would fit into everyday society. This is a contemporary fantasy, so it's kind of a reimagining of what our world today would be like if we had this source of music. And I liked how she talked about how different problems would be dealt with and how different technologies would work if the source of power was music and how that would affect the type of jobs people would get. I also really enjoyed the magical school aspect of this because I learned a lot about the actual theory of Musicraft and how different types of music lend themselves to different types of magic. Regarding the magical school aspect, sometimes the book can be a little bit hard to read because it does rely so much on that imposter syndrome, and I don't always need to revisit that feeling. But it felt very natural, and Amelia had a really interesting and a very motivated personality that you were really rooting for her to work hard and succeed. Regarding Amelia, I really liked the direction that this book took with her. A lot of her development has to do with her processing the death of her mother and the grief that comes along with that, especially as how that relates to her relationship with music. Her mom was a very talented flute player, and so Amelia really wants to live in her footsteps. I liked how this was a consistent motivating factor throughout her time, as well as the fact that the narrative tried to deconstruct this motivation a little bit. I also really liked the friendship dynamics in this book. She has one friendship with a boy named Jai, who she meets at her audition, and also with a kind of hate-to-friend relationship with her roommate. That's one instance of like a very common trope. But this book did it really well. It was very understandable why the roommate didn't like her. And I really liked how this mystery element kind of brought a lot of the characters together. I think some of the subplots in this book were solved a little bit too easily, or just not given the same amount of depth that other plots were given. Like, for example, there's a subplot with her grandmother that I don't think was resolved very well or just very effectively. It kind of just felt like there was a solution, an explanation just tossed in at the end of the book. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars, and I highly recommend it if you really want a fun middle grade. As of right now, I believe this is a standalone, but I really feel like this could be a series. I feel like the world that she established is so much fun, especially with this magical school. There's just so many different directions you could go into. I don't know if the author has intentions to add more to the series as of now, but if she does, I will read it. Also, definitely recommend to listen to the audiobook because there's a lot of music incorporated into it. I believe Audible even has like a behind the scenes of making this audiobook, because since music is constantly being played throughout the story, there is these songs being played in the story as well. Just really enjoyable time. And I read this for the prompt of reading a fantastical story for middle grade magic. The next book that I read was Inside Out and Back Again by Tang Ha Lai. This is a historical fiction novel written in verse, telling the story of a 10-year-old girl named Ha who is forced to leave her city of Saigon during the Vietnam War. She ends up moving to Alabama with her mom and her brothers and is forced to adapt and try to assimilate into this completely foreign culture. This book is very short. Like I said, it's written in verse, so it reads very fluidly and very quickly. And it's divided into sections by date, kind of like journal entries, and you're kind of following Ha as she's processing all these different experiences and new emotions. And I really enjoyed this free verse writing style. I think it gave the text a sense of immediacy and helped you really understand what it's like to be in the mind of this 10-year-old girl going through all these massive changes. As you can imagine from the description, this book does deal with a lot of heavy themes. There's this constant theme of grief throughout the novel for a lot of different reasons. There is grief for leaving your home and leaving the people and possessions that you really cared about. There's also this complicated grief that comes with the uncertainty of whether Ha's dad is going to come back because he is a prisoner of war. And there's also a really big sense of frustration, especially as Ha is trying to adapt to her new surroundings in a school that is mocking her for how she speaks and how she looks. The author's writing was very beautiful and very poignant, but I do wish we got to spend a little bit more time in each section. Like I said, this book is really short, and while I think she didn't get across the emotions going on, I would have personally preferred if we got to really digest them a little more, especially when it came to understanding other people in her life, like her mom or her brothers. I do understand that it was probably intentional to keep the narrative focus kind of narrowed because you are in the head of this 10-year-old, and at that age you're kind of just consumed with what you're feeling at the time and not really what others are. But yeah, just personal preference, I probably would have preferred to have a little bit more explored. This book actually reminded me a lot of Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga that I read earlier this year. They had very similar stories and styles, which is interesting because they deal with such different areas of the world and different times. This book takes place 50 years before Other Words for Home, and yet what the characters are going through and all the themes being explored are very similar, which I think adds a lot of weight to both stories, which is really kind of heartbreaking that this similar suffering and grief is still being experienced by people in the world. I believe both authors were inspired by either their own lives or from the people in their lives, and so I'm glad these kind of stories are able to be told. So again, I gave this one 4 stars, and I read this for the prompt that was read a book with a serious topic. The next book I read I'm not going to talk too much about because it's a picture book, and that is Sulwe by Lupita Nyong'o. And I read this for the prompt of reading a bedtime story, and it was just lovely. This is about a young girl who starts feeling insecure because her skin is darker than that of her family and that of her classmates. And so she is told this very magical and whimsical story that kind of helps her change that perspective. I watched an interview with Lupita Nyong'o where she talked about how she was inspired to write this because she would receive letters from young girls telling her that they never would have thought that a dark-skinned black girl would be presented as beautiful in mainstream media because society was always trying to tear them down. And so she wrote this book to remind these young girls just how beautiful they are. The artwork is also so stunning. If you ever see this like in the library, the bookstore, definitely check it out just for that. It's beautiful. And yes, this was just a really cute, wholesome read. The next book I read was Once Upon an Eid, edited by S.K. Ali and Aisha Saeed. This is an anthology of short stories, all written by Muslim authors, that all center around the holiday of Eid, which is the biggest holiday for Muslims. So right off the bat, I knew I was going to really enjoy this because just its very existence makes me very happy. When I was younger, I really never thought that I would see Muslims or Eid and Ramadan being explored and represented in the books that I read. And so to have this whole anthology dedicated to that just makes me really happy. I love how this collection showed just how diverse the Muslim community is. There are so many different types of experiences and backgrounds. There are Black, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Arab. There are even Sunni and Shia stories. There's just a lot of diversity with how different cultures and communities celebrate Eid. There are also a lot of different types of stories in here. There are a lot of really happy and fun ones, but also kind of more somber and emotional ones. There's a mix of prose and verse and even a comic in here. So I think there's definitely something that you can find that you'll enjoy in this anthology. I really enjoyed all of these stories, but some of my favorite ones were Perfect by Jamila Thompson Bigelow. That has to do with a girl feeling distant from her West African culture and feeling insecure about it when she goes to a big family event. Do Not Break Traditions by S.K. Ali. This has to do with someone trying to maintain any tradition even when their home life changes when their mom gets ill. Searching for Blue by N.H. Senzai deals with someone who was a victim of the refugee crisis in Syria, celebrating Eid after being displaced from their home. And Taste by Hannah Al-Kaf, which deals with trying to celebrate a holiday while also grieving someone you loved. Again, I also gave this 4 stars. There was a lot of heart to it, a lot of emotion, and I definitely recommend it. Oh yeah, and so I read this for the prompt of read a book that gives you hope. as this is called Stories of Hope and Joy. And I also read it for the prompt of read a book with a character or author who has a similar trait to you, and because all of these characters are Muslim and I'm Muslim. And that also counted for the prompt of read a book by a marginalized author that would give you joy. These next two I'm going to talk about, one I did read for middle grade magic and the other one I read after it, but I'm just going to talk about them together. And that's Sal and Gabi Break the Universe and Sal and Gabi Fix the Universe by Carlos Hernandez. And I read this for the prompt of read a book with a character who is different from you, because the character and author are Cuban American. So it's honestly kind of hard to explain this book. It's kind of wacky. So essentially you follow a 7th grade boy named Sal Vidon who is entering this new school called the Coleco School of Performing Arts. Kind of reminded me of Hollywood Arts from Victorious. And Sal's talent is that he is a magician. He likes to play tricks and illusions on people, but one of those tricks where he puts a raw chicken in someone's locker ends up getting him sent to the principal's office, where he meets a very bubbly and confident and intellectual girl named Gabi Real. While Sal is an illusionist in the traditional sense, he also has this ability to break the universe. He can kind of cut holes into the universe and reach and take things from other universes, which is how he got the raw chicken to be in a locker. And so the rest of the book is kind of just him and Gabi going along these shenanigans. So I kind of had mixed feelings about this book, but I'll start off with the positives. Like I said, this book is just really wacky, but I thought it was really fun. Like seeing the way that this art school is run, there's a lot of funny and interesting classes and assignments that he has to do. There are a lot of fun sci-fi elements, like different machines and robots that they talk to, as well as all the mixed universe things going on. That's actually something that I do want to note, because I was not misled, I just didn't know going into the book that this was a sci-fi book and not having to do with mythology. I just assumed that all the books in the Rick Riordan Presents line were about mythology and kind of had the same vibe as like Arusha, which I had read previously. But no, this one is completely sci-fi and honestly very much rooted in contemporary. But there's definitely a lot of Cuban culture mixed in, especially as this takes place in Miami. I really enjoyed how unapologetic and how Spanish was just casually interwoven throughout the whole novel. There was also representation for diabetes, as Sal himself has diabetes. I can't comment on the accuracy of the portrayal, but I did enjoy how it wasn't just something that was mentioned and how it actively played a part in his character and the things that he could do and be mindful of, like in terms of energy and food consumption. There's also a lot of wholesome moments with family and friends that I definitely enjoyed. Where my downsides are with the series kind of has more to do with the writing and structural aspects. There wasn't really an overarching plot that was driving the narrative forward. It was just kind of like, shenanigan happens, cool. Next shenanigan happens, cool. And in the beginning, I was kind of just like rolling with it and I was having fun, but at some point I did lose momentum and it was kind of hard for me to get motivated to continue reading. And I think I would have been fine if only the plot was like that, but also the characters were largely pretty static throughout the whole story. There was nothing pushing the story forward, which really hindered my enjoyment. This did actually improve in the second book. There is a kind of antagonist storyline going on, as well as the fact that the second book is just dealing with consequences of different things that happened in the first book. Also thematically, I think the second book was a lot more cohesive. Another thing that might have just been a fault of mine, because I was looking for something that perhaps the book never promised to give, but I just never knew what this book wanted to be. Like every single time I thought we were going in some sort of thematic direction, at least in the first book, we would just be like taken somewhere else. Like there is a subplot that has to do with Sal processing the death of his mother, and I really liked that, and I wish, like honestly, the whole story, or at least a bigger part of the story, was dedicated to that. Because I thought it was so interesting, especially the way that it was incorporated with the sci-fi element. And the last thing I'll say that I didn't really love about either book was that I just felt they were too long for the story being told. It kind of had this pattern of something would happen and then Sal would spend a lot of time in his internal monologue explaining what happened. And while it made sense because it was Sal's personality, that's just how his mind works, because he's an illusionist and he has to really be constantly thinking about all the details. It kind of just bogged me down even more, especially as I said before, there wasn't much motivating the story forward. I definitely don't want to deter people from reading it because I think there's a lot of really awesome things that are discussed in it and a lot of really nice lessons that occur. I feel like I would enjoy this more if it was in a TV show form, like either like an animated sitcom, something like that. Because those are the kind of things where I can just watch an episode, have a good time, and then come back whenever to watch the next episodes. And I did hear that this was optioned to become a show for Disney Channel, which would be perfect, and I would definitely check it out if it ends up happening like that. So I'm still not totally sure of what I'm rating this. I think the first book would probably be like 2 or 2.5 stars, and the second book would be 3 stars. So the next series that I read was also Rick Rider Presents one, and that was the Storm Runner series by J.C. Cervantes. So this follows a boy named Zane Obispo who lives next to this volcano that he frequently explores. One day, a mysterious airplane crashes into that volcano. At the same time, a girl named Brooks comes to his door and tells them that he is connected to a prophecy dealing with the Mayan god of death who is imprisoned in that volcano. Zane then finds himself in this world of Mayan mythology, and him and Brooks, as well as his uncle Hondo, go on this adventure. I can't really say a lot too much, I don't want to give too much about the plot, but you can kind of guess what the story is kind of dealing with. It follows a pretty familiar middle grade fantasy plotline. So I actually really enjoyed this series as a whole, though I enjoyed the second two books more than this first book. What I will say about the series as a whole is that even though I just said it follows a familiar setup of middle grade fantasy, it actually goes in a lot of directions that I don't expect, which made the plot really exciting because I was actually really unsure of what was going to happen next. I also really love the world of this series. It's probably my favorite part. This was the first time that I was really learning about Mayan mythology, and I found it so interesting. All the stories were incorporated so well, and I think the author did a really good job of establishing a lot of the mythological and magical elements so that when things happened in the plot and problems arise in the plot, it made sense and you could actually understand the significance of them. I find that an issue in some fantasy books where stakes can be raised, but because you didn't spend the time to establish why exactly the stakes were raised, you don't actually feel that as a reader. Definitely in the second and third books, I did feel that way. In this first book, I did have some issues. I thought the pacing was a little bit inconsistent, as well as the fact that I wasn't a huge fan of how the disability representation was handled. So Zane was born with one leg shorter than the other, and so he walks with a cane, and he has this kind of complicated relationship with that, especially in terms of having a lot of internalized ableism. And it's one of those things where I understood what the author was trying to do. I think she was trying to convey this grappling that people have when they're that age and have dealt with bullying for having a disability. But I think it lacked a lot of nuance. For the most part, I don't even think it was a gradual change. It more so felt like the whole book he just didn't like having his disability and really hated it. And then the moment where he realizes that it's kind of useful, he switches. And there's also a scene that teeters dangerously close to the magical cure trope. It's one of those things where I understood what the author was intending, but I don't think it was effectively accomplished. This series also has a really interesting narrative technique. In his first book, Zane is kind of writing this account of what happened to the gods. You don't really know why or the circumstances surrounding it until the end, but once you figure it out, it's actually really intriguing, and I really like that aspect, and it added an interesting twist that I wasn't expecting. And the implications of that twist continue to play into the second and third books, which I really enjoyed. So the Rick Rider Presents read-along group, we had a live show interview with the author, and something that she said that I could kind of tell was that she didn't know if she was going to get a sequel deal for this book. And while she left space for more of the story, this book kind of feels like its own thing. Obviously, when I had only read this book, that wasn't something that I noticed, but after reading the second and third book, I do like the way the second and third book connect to each other as opposed to how this connects to those. One thing that I think hindered me from giving the next two books a full 5 stars was I wish there was more character exploration done. I really enjoyed Zane's voice, and I think he had a lot of learning and stepping up to do. But in particular, Brooks, I feel like we kind of lost her character by the end. In terms of page time, we didn't see her as much. And so by the end, I didn't really feel like I really understood her to a deep level. I don't want to spoil, but there is something that happens that introduces a lot of new characters in the second and third book, and mostly in the third book. And it's one of those things where I understand why they were introduced late into the series, but I wish they were introduced earlier because I think it would have been so cool to explore them further. I did really enjoy some of the side characters. I really enjoyed Uncle Hondo. I think he had a really nice character arc. He reminded me a lot of Sokka, actually, from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I also really liked the antagonist characters. And I specify antagonists as opposed to villains because this series has both. The antagonists were really interesting both in their motivations and their relationships to the main characters. And as a reader, I truly didn't know whether they were going to be on our side or turn against us. It was this really fun dynamic. And so again, I kind of had a hard time figuring out a rating for the first book in particular, but I think I settled on 3.5, and I gave the second and third 4 stars. Definitely recommend for a really rich world and exciting plot. And the last book that I have to talk about, and the only YA book I have, is The Kingdom of Back by Marie Lu. This is a historical fantasy novel following the Mozart siblings. In particular, we follow the perspective of Nannerl, who was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's older sister, who was just as much as a child prodigy as Mozart was, but because of the kind of sexist standards of her time, she wasn't really able to pursue her passion of music as her brother was. Nannerl has this fear that she is going to be forgotten, so one day she is visited by this fairy prince named Hyacinth, and she makes a deal with him that he will help her live her dream if she helps him get his fairy kingdom back. I absolutely love this book. I think it's going to be one of my new favorites. Marie Lu's writing is absolutely stunning. I haven't read anything by her since the Legend series all those years ago, but her writing is so freaking beautiful. It's very lyrical and creates such a wondrous and whimsical atmosphere, which is very fitting as the story is so ingrained with music. I think what I love most about this book was just how much I connected to Nannerl and her dreams and her hopes and her fears. I think a lot of people could relate to that, about having a passion and having the fear that it could just be taken from your hands. I forgot to mention that Hyacinth is from the Kingdom of Back, which is a real thing that Nannerl and Wolfgang used to talk about when they used to travel to different countries performing. And Marie Lu just took that concept and turned it into a real magical world. But I wouldn't go into this expecting a traditional fantasy. The Kingdom of Back is really a device to portray what's going on in Nannerl's real life. It's kind of this mirror of her emotional state, and in that sense I think it's so well done. I also really liked how this book portrayed the complicated relationship between Nannerl and her brother, because she loves him and she cares for him, but she does have this kind of deep-rooted resentment over the fact that he gets to do everything that she wanted. I think it was very raw and very emotional and very realistic. And all that together, the atmosphere, the wonderful characterization, and the lyrical writing made for such powerful moments that made me have to stop reading and take a second back because I was just so affected by it. It really surprised me when I saw that this had a Goodreads rating of below 4 stars, because I just absolutely adored it. But I do think it's because of just how much I resonated with it. This is one of those cases where historically we know the outcome. We know that Nannerl isn't remembered because she's just not talked about as much as her brother. And I think a lot of people might find that kind of depressing. But Marie Lu crafts it in a way that makes it hopeful. Especially if you read her author's note and you see what her relationship to this book was. I came out of this book feeling bittersweet, but also with that sense of hope. The only con I really have for this story is that I think sometimes the timeline is a little bit confusing to follow, or at least the passages of time, because this takes over a very long time. We start when Nannerl is very young, like 8 years old, and we end when she's 16, and there are some moments where I just didn't know how old she was, and I didn't understand how much time had actually passed. But that's a very minor thing. Like I said, everything else I thought was brilliant. So those are all the books that I have to talk about today. Please let me know your thoughts about these books, if you read them, if you haven't read them. This was a lot of middle grade. I think after I finish the rest of the books in the Rick Riordan Presents read along, because I'm a little bit behind, I have some books left, I might take a little break from middle grade, or at least middle grade fantasy. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, leave a comment, and consider subscribing if you did. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.